build up, Janine. My name's Gareth Harris. I always say I'm an academic in the broadest sense of the word, and what I mean by that is I worked 15 years as a chef and then returned to university late in life. And I suppose why I tell people that at the start is because people often have this idea of academics sitting in a sort of ivory tower, smoking a pipe and drinking a glass of sherry. And I'm not that sort of academic, and there aren't many of those left anyway these days. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is understanding and challenging anti-minority narratives. And I'll break this down and explain what I mean by this in a bit. First, a little bit about my background. I started working in this field in about 2006, 2007, when the British National Party were doing very well in the polls. I was involved in some work in Barking and Dagenham, where they had 12 councillors and were the party of opposition. I was later commissioned by a special interest group for managing far-right activity to do, as part of a research team looking at support for the English Defence League in 2 English towns, one of which is Luton, the other one was Blackburn with Darwin. And I'll be talking about that in the second presentation. Since then, for the last sort of 3 years really, I've been involved in running a local authority network, peer-to-peer network, called the Special Interest Group for Counter-Extremism. And this really, it's not rocket science or anything complicated. It's just the idea that local areas experience similar issues. If you put your heads together, then you might, you can exchange learning and experience on it to develop better responses. Now, this first slide, I put 2 pictures up here to sort of really illustrate the sort of breadth of the issue that we're talking about today. The first one on my left, I'd imagine quite a few of you will know what it is. It's the ammunition cases of the Christchurch killer in New Zealand who attacked a mosque. And why have I put it up here? Because in among all the references to obscure battles in the Balkans, right at the top, it said for Rotherham. So an Australian extreme right terrorist, white supremacist, attacks a mosque in New Zealand and refers to a small town in South Yorkshire. And of course, he's referred to this town because of the scandal around CSE, child sexual exploitation cases. So this, what happens in a small town in South Yorkshire can have international ramifications. Now, on the other side, you're probably not as familiar with this. This is a poster from the Justice for Our Boys campaign. Note on the back of it, there's, first, right at the top, it says never surrender. So this is a slogan of Loyalist Ireland. There's a yellow vest behind it as well. And this is a Justice for Our Boys is a campaign started by a woman in West London after her son was killed in a hit and run, along with 2 other lads. The driver of the car was Asian, and when this horrible incident happened, it was jumped on by various people across the sort of anti-minority spectrum, people like Tommy Robinson, Britain First, who cited it as a terrorist attack. Now, the driver of the car was hit as a Muslim terrorist attack. The driver of the car was Hindu, and it was drunk driving. But the point of me putting this here is a very local incident provided an opportunity for anti-minority actors to mobilise around. And really, that's what this presentation today is mainly about. It is a long presentation, so I've sat in on enough of these webinars to know that it's beneficial to have a cup of tea break in the middle. So I will offer you a break in the middle, which will also be your chance to ask questions. And then at the end, there will also be another chance to ask questions. So what am I going to cover today? Okay, the structure of today, introduction, which I've already done. You can ask more about that in the break if you want. I've used this phrase anti-minority narrative, so I'll explain what I mean by both bits of that. I will talk about the range of what I call anti-minority activity, the different groups and actors who are involved, and why it matters to differentiate between them. I will talk about the sort of issues and concerns or events that provide windows of opportunity for anti-minority actors. And I will also make the argument that they are opportunities for those of us who have responsibility to responding to their activities. I will sort of bring it all together with a brief discussion of some work that I was involved in around a campaign in Sunderland, which I'll talk at much more length on Friday about, and I will talk briefly in terms of strategic response. Not really in terms of this is what you should do, because I don't believe in that. I'm not someone who's going to come to your area and tell you what to do. I'm someone who goes across the country, sees various things in different places, and sees some sort of general patterns. So it's more of a sort of points to consider rather than sort of explicit guidance. Okay, so that's the general structure of the presentation today, and now I'll sort of go into it. Okay, so taking this phrase anti-minority narratives, why am I using that? Okay, a narrative is a story that sets an event into a meaningful context. You know, it's how we make sense of the world. It's also an interpretation of the world from a very specific perspective. You know, this is the most academic bit of it, so bear with me. How persuasive a narrative is supported by the credibility of who is telling it and rests on what you already know about the world. So if you take the example that I've used on the first slide, a woman's son is killed in a horrific drink driving incident in Hayes. That becomes part of the story about that the driver was Muslim, that it was a terrorist, that it was done as a terrorist act, it was committed with intent. And then that becomes enveloped in a wider story about, you know, Muslims are a fifth column within Britain, etc., etc. The West and Islam are incompatible. And then it builds up into a bigger narrative. So this is how certain events will fit into that narrative to support it. Some of these stories are old ones. That the print, the woodblock print at the top slide is an 18th century print about gypsies stealing children. Yeah, this is an old story that we've all heard about. Last year, I'm based in Norfolk. We had child abduction rumours against Romanians in Great Yarmouth. And I'd also heard of this this story going around in Skegness as well. And I suspect maybe I might be wrong, and I'd be grateful if someone could tell me if it's true. If this story has gone around in Scarborough as well. Yeah, this is quite, yeah, it's an old story, but one that still has current currency. Some of the things that, you know, make a narrative believable is the credibility of who is telling it. If you again think about the slide that I showed you in the first thing, it's the mother who is saying this was a terrorist attack. That is very hard to counter. And also, when narratives resonate with people, is when they have that emotional content. I find it very difficult, as a father, I find it difficult to talk about a mother who's lost a son in a hit and run. It's very emotive. It resonates with people. So this is why I think narratives are important, because it's we interpret the world through stories, and stories but a certain interpretation of the world. They identify a problem, and they often identify someone who is to blame for it as well as offering a solution. So the other part of that phrase, narratives. So I've explained what I mean by narrative and why I think it's important. It's not something that's just esoteric or academic. And anti-minority. So an anti-minority narrative is a specific sort of narrative. I've said that a narrative can often point to, you know, where there is a problem in the world and who is to blame with it for it. An anti-minority narrative is one that promotes hatred, feelings of superiority against ethnic, religious or sexual minorities. These are often far right or extreme right wing, but not necessarily so. You know, they can also, you could talk about anti-trans narratives or anti-LGBTQ narratives. These often overlap with the far right or extreme right, but they don't necessarily belong to that. So a lot of people will come back to me and say, Gareth, well, why are you inventing another term for this? Why are you talking about anti-minority narratives? Why don't you just call it out and call the far right the far right? And there's a certain element of truth in that, I think, you know, the sort of Ron Seal approach, call it what it is. But the fact is, things have moved on a lot. When I was a kid, the far right was very obvious. It was, I'm betraying my age here, it was skinheads walking down the street covered in swastikas, much like the gentleman you see in the top slide. These people are still about, there's no two ways about it, but the anti-minority scene is much more diverse now. We need to recognise that the anti-minority narratives can emerge in different forms. So I've tried to sort of juxtapose the old image of your stereotypical EDL supporter, couple of Stellas on a march with two people underneath. So these two people underneath, you can see both their names are there. Lauren Southern, who is a Canadian sort of alt-right vlogger, and Brittany Pettibone, now Brittany Sellner, who is an American alt-right vlogger. She is now married to Martin Sellner, the leader of the Austrian Generation Identity. These are very influential people in the online space. You can see the contrast. The contrast is quite obvious. Why does it matter? Why does it matter that, you know, why am I talking to you about two sort of vloggers based in the Americas? Okay, in 2018, February the 24th, Lauren Southern and Brittany Pettibone, along with Calum Robertson, who's the gentleman on the far right, excuse the pun, they set up a stall in Luton saying with the slogan, Allah is a gay god, on a rainbow flag. Now, Luton is, at the 2011 poll, is a quarter percent population Muslim, and quite conservative Muslim as well. So you could imagine what sort of reaction a stall, Allah is a gay god, is going to provoke. Why did they do this? Because they're trying to, they wanted a reaction from, you know, Muslim residents of Luton that was vociferous, that was violent, that they could film, that they could upload onto social media and then spread across the world. And then people will view it however many times. As a consequence of this action, two of these, Brittany Pettibone and Lauren Southern, and her now husband Martin Sellner, were refused entry to the UK by UK border force when they tried to come back in, which then led to Day of Freedom marches later in the year. Now, these were big marches in London. I mean, it's always hard to pin down the numbers, but we are talking between 10 and 20,000. Some of the biggest marches associated with the far right for some considerable time, or anti-minority actors. These also brought a very diverse coalition of people together, from your die-hard sort of neo-Nazis to your Free Tommy crowd, to your libertarians, to your free speech advocates. This is a place where they can all come together and network as well. So the basic premise behind this, also the thing to think about, is actions have consequences. You know, UK border force decided to bar those activists from entering the UK, which you can argue is a good thing or not. But every decision that you make, and this is something that I cannot emphasize strongly enough, every decision you can make, either at a national, regional or local level, has a consequence. There is always a dilemma involved. So by banning those activists to gain entry to the country, they stop them coming to the UK. But what in turn, what it created was a big mobilisation around freedom of speech, initially at Hyde Park, several very, very large-scale demos where they just put big screens up and projected speeches by the activists who had been banned. And I would argue the result was that people networked across the anti-minority spectrum. So I've said a lot about anti-minority spectrum. And what do I mean by this? Oh no, I'll go back a little bit. Going back to credibility of stories. The point about a narrative is for it to resonate with people, they have to believe it. So what are the things that make some stories more credible than others? First of all, there's the wider picture. What's going on in the press and what's going on across the country. So if you take, I've given you shots there. I mean, one of the key things that anti-minority actors have mobilised around in recent years, and this is changing now, has been sexual exploitation, or what I would call sort of racialised narratives of sexual violence. And this is, again, this sort of emotive appeal of it is very powerful. When a lot of this is going on, if you're a resident of Rotherham and this is in the press and then you're seeing it on your local street, you're seeing people in court, it sort of has a process of mutual reinforcement. I've also said they're reinforced by pre-existing knowledge and lived experience. Now, the example of CSE is one that we all know and is sort of much more high level. On a more sort of mundane level, I brought a picture of a boarded up pub in my area in Norwich. Why have I got a picture of a boarded up pub in Norwich? Because one of the stories that we're all familiar about is that pubs are shutting down. So the story, a story that is, you can interpret this many ways. Why are the pubs shutting down? One story is that, especially in areas that have a Muslim population, the area's being taken over by Muslims. Muslims don't drink. All the pubs are being shut down. And this pub, in fact, has been turned into Norwich's latest mosque. So that reinforces an idea. People see that my local's been turned into a mosque. The Muslims are invading. Blah blah blah. Another story might be, well, people don't drink as much in pubs anymore. They go to supermarkets. We have different patterns of socialisation than we did when I was a kid or my parents. Things have moved on. That's a much more complicated story and much more nuanced. Moving on. So if I took that picture of the pub that is being boarded up and being converted into a mosque from the local paper, and then I looked at the comments board. So at the top, no racism, it's a theocracy. Notice the caveat, this is not racism. It's a theocracy, one totally intent on our destruction. Read their book. There's no such thing as Islamophobia. It's an irrational fear. Being afraid of people who are taught by their leaders and their book to kill infidels is wholly rational. Therefore, Islamophobia doesn't exist. But you want Norwich to be turned into the ghettos of Whitechapel Road, Bradford, Leicester. There's no reasoning with you. Believe me, I live in Norwich and it's not approaching Whitechapel Road by a long way, or Bradford. Then underneath, it needs something to happen. The current setup is an eyesore and a disgrace. Good luck with the venture. Look forward to seeing something a lot more appealing than present. So there's also a debate here. And I often think, we don't often really, understand the debate that is going on. And what's important is, where are we in this conversation? And this is something that I will come back to again and again, is that you cannot, these conversations are going on in communities, whether you like it or not, but where are we in it and who are we speaking to? Some of this, I talked about these bigger narratives that these little things can support. So the idea that your local pub has shut up shop and been converted into a mosque becomes, you see that on your street, and then you go online and you see things like the Great Replacement. This is a grand narrative that the indigenous white British population of the UK or of European countries is being deliberately replaced by migration. Notice the sort of juxtaposition of images, the two images. it's a very visual thing. You know, you'll see a lot of this online. It's visually it makes sense when you see this picture. You know, things have changed. The Great Replacement was a theory that was referenced again by the Christchurch mosque killer. I think sometimes what is important is we often focus on these big narratives and the ideologies, but what sometimes is important is to tear them apart a bit and think what lies between them. Often stuff around migration, when you see it on anti-minority websites and in digital space, there's often it often refers to things like, we were never asked, you know, this wasn't our choice. So for me, when people start talking about things like the Great Replacement, it starts hinting about, this appeals to people because it appeals to their sense that they no longer have control or a say in the decisions that affect their life. And really, for me, that's how I think we should be thinking about, okay, you know, if you come back to me and say, Gareth, this is all very good, but how we should respond to it, I will start saying things like, well, you need to involve people, you need to help people feel that they have some say in what is going on. Because if people don't feel that is happening, then groups like Generation Identity or some of the groups that I'll talk about in a minute will fill that gap, basically. Okay, I've talked a lot about the spectrum of far-right activity, or the spectrum of anti-minority activity. What I often do is use this slide to sort of explain what I mean. Now, if you think here, there's two axes. So the X is racial nationalism at one extreme. So this means die-hard sort of neo-Nazi revolutionary groups that, you know, profess allegiance to the 14 words. You know, for those of you who don't know what the 14 words are, they're sort of a slogan of revolutionary National Socialism. We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children. People at this end of the spectrum are people who, you know, are white supremacists. At the other end, your civic nationalism, you know, this is much more inclusive. You know, you can come to Britain, you can become part of, you know, you abide by sort of, you integrate and you abide by British rules. I must stress this diagram is not meant to say that everybody is extremist within it, but it's a way about mapping out the territory. Then if you think about these different groups like BNP, National Action, For Britain, so they vary somewhere on this spectrum in their adherence between conceptions of civic to racial nationalism. These groups are also differentiated by the strategies and the tactics that they use. Now, this can go from democratic means, so political parties who are competing at the ballot box, to illegal means, to sort of revolutionary that is beyond sort of the legal bar. So this is how you can start dividing up these groups. And, you know, there's a couple of things about this. This also sort of refers, you can also overlap policy spaces almost with it. And I'll sort of go through it. So the quadrant, the square in the bottom right, this is the one that is probably hardest to sort of get your head around. It's where there's a low commitment to political ideals. So not really that ideologically driven, but there's a high commitment to illegal means. And I think here you can put, I was reading the Prevent statistics recently, and there is a large and rising degree of Prevent referrals that are put into a box of no affiliated ideology. And this is where it fits. This is where your school shooters, maybe serious youth violence, your more football hooligan type groups would fit. Really, this is a strictly police space. This is criminal behaviour. Going up to the quadrant square on your top right, this one's much more clear cut. very ideologically driven, politically motivated, seeking political gains, revolutionary gains, high commitment to illegal action. These are your terrorist groups, and groups that border on that edge of terrorism. These are your lone actors like Darren Osborne. These are groups like National Action, now proscribed, Sonnenkrieg Division. These are pretty easy to identify. Really, this is your prevent and pursue space. Where it starts getting more messy is on the other side. So if we take top left, this is again quite politically driven, but no commitment really to illegal action. You could put your sort of alt-right people here, Brittany Pettibone that I mentioned. Then the quadrant below, democratic means. So these are people who might be more committed to some form of nationalism, even some form of exclusionary nationalism. And you could, but they are seeking to achieve their aims through the ballot box. I put UKIP with a question mark. This group is not necessarily extremist, or not necessarily, is not covered by the extremism space. What is interesting is most of the people that we are dealing with, most of the people who will be your bread and butter, most of the people that we are concerned with, people like Stephen Yaxley Lennon, the EDL, they don't really exist anymore, nor the BNP. Britain First, who are quite active now, and Patriotic Alternative, who are also active, especially in Yorkshire. They tread this line somewhere over the border between legal and illegal means. Some of them, there is a difference between someone like Stephen Yaxley Lennon and Patriotic Alternative, and I will speak about that in a minute. Then you might say, it might come back to the so what question. So what, Gareth, if there's all these differences with these different groups? Why does it matter to us? Because they're all promoting hatred, superiority against other people. Why it matters is because your response they use different narratives to mobilize support. And if you want to intervene in this process, your response needs to be aligned to the threat. So you cannot treat a group that belongs in this democratic sort of more civic nationalism arena in the same way that you treat a group like National Action. It will not work, and I would argue will make the problem worse. Okay. This, I've just sort of added, this is my sort of anti-minority mood board in a way, and this is just a sort of a few slides, a few pictures just to illustrate how far things have moved on from the 80s and 90s, from when I was growing up. You know, how diverse the threat and risk is, and the sort of range of activity. So going at the most extreme, well, arguably the most extreme. Top right, this is a photo again of the Christchurch mosque killer, but if you notice the symbol there, so there's the OK symbol, which is a sort of a meme that's been reappropriated by the revolutionary right, really. And this is a little bit of an in-joke, and this is the killer sort of signalling to his audience. On the other side, on the far left, you've got Veterans Against Terrorism, Football Lads Alliance. There's been a lot of arguments about these groups. I wouldn't call them a far-right groups. Other people would. They were protesting against terrorism. They held big demos in London. FLA held demos of almost 30,000 without any public fanfare. In between the two of them, you have the ever famous Luton's favourite son, Stephen Yaxley Lennon. I would argue a bit on the sort of downturn at the moment. He's a bit on his uppers. Bottom left, National Action, now proscribed in 2016. This is them in York. In the middle, Justice for Women and Children is a campaign group set up in Sunderland that campaigns against sexual grooming and forced adoption. it's not necessarily far right, but if you have a look at their Facebook page, it's often mixed in with anti-Muslim narratives and a lot of other stuff as well. In the far right bottom corner, my favourite sort of hallmark card for the far right, this is Brittany Petterbone, who I talked about earlier, who married Martin Sellner, the Austrian leader of Generation Identity, who did have a UK branch but have disbanded now. And they've just reformed within the UK literally the other day. So what I would like to do now, I realise that this is just like an avalanche of information. And what I found with these online webinars is it's often good to have a cup of tea in the middle. So I'm suggesting a 10-minute break now, which is also a chance for you to ask me questions. So I'm going to go back to my desktop and hopefully we'll have some questions on the chat or through raised hands. Thank you. And 10 minutes, so I'm taking the time as, sorry, I've just got to check my phone. It's 11:15, so we'll come back at 11:25. Yes. Yes.
Gareth, got a question which you might want to address from Ben when folk sort of come back. He works for Prevent in North Yorkshire Police. And he was wondering whether you suspected that Scarborough may have had the same rumours spread as elsewhere in relation to the Romanians.
Is Ben there now?
Yeah, I just thought if you wait and then address that question when everybody comes back, then everybody can hear the answer.
Hi Gareth, it's Ben speaking. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you, Ben. I don't know whether Gareth.
Gareth, I just put the question there so that you could maybe allude to it once everyone was back.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I just wondered why you'd thought that Scarborough might have been subject to the same rumours as elsewhere. I didn't know if you'd heard something and something we weren't aware of. That was all.
No, it's not as much that I've heard something, but there were rumours. It seems to have cropped up in a lot of coastal seaside towns. So I've heard it definitely from Yarmouth, Skegness and Margate as well. And I do think there are issues around, some of those, some of these seaside, especially sort of, holiday towns, cities, Blackpool as well is another one. They've often had very similar issues that are quite specific to them. Margate as well. They've often had quite significant issues with some variant of anti-minority support. But I think in this case it might be more to do where Roma population have settled and where there is seasonal work as well. But I haven't heard anything specific to Scarborough. I do. There is something around coastal towns that's interesting.
Yeah, no, that's great, Gareth. I just was checking it wasn't something specific to Scarborough. Yeah. We hadn't sort of missed something, that's all.
No, pat yourself on the back. You haven't missed something there.
Good. Okay. Cheers.
There's another question about safeguarding. And I do touch on this in the next couple of slides, but I think well, one of the things we've definitely seen with the sort of, I've talked a lot about what's different between the 80s, 90s and now. And obviously one of the big things that's different is the use of online space. With the increased use of online space, what we definitely have seen is a targeting of people with mental health vulnerabilities, people, or sometimes people who are sitting on somewhere on the sort of autism spectrum, and there's been a deliberate targeting around that. And I can remember having a conversation with a former activist who was active in the 90s, and he said to me, we would have never approached these people back in the 90s or early 2000s because we would have seen them as a security threat. But now with the spread of online mobilisation and recruitment, this has really changed. So I think, this has definitely become a growing area. especially at the harder end of the spectrum. You've had a chance to get a cup of tea or coffee or whatever. I am aware that it's an awful lot of information. Someone's asked about slides, so the slides will go out. And I often think on these things, people need a bit of time to digest stuff. So I think I will work with, if there's enough interest, is work with Janine and Leslie to sort of maybe have a sort of open session at some point where people can come back to me after they've looked at the slides and asked specific questions, because that's useful for me as well. But unless anybody has anything burning now, I'm going to go back for sort of 10-15 minutes on the presentation, and I will try and sort of whiz through this a little bit because I would like people to ask questions. So now I'm going back to the slides. Right, that's the start. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you now.
Right, I'm going to kick off again now then. Okay, so I've talked about the spectrum. So the spectrum of anti-minority activity, I've talked about differences between them and why it matters. So who's in this sort of spectrum? So for one, you have revolutionary groups. These are your neo-Nazi groups. They are seeking revolutionary change. You can break down this into two ways. There are lone actor attacks. So you have people like Pavlo Lapshin, Ukraine against the UK, murdered Muslim man over in the Black Country, planted a bomb outside a mosque, hoping to target Friday prayers, but got the timing wrong. It would have been horrendous if it had been timed properly. You also have Thomas Mayer, murder of Joe Cox. What's interesting about Mayer is that he actually had he really wasn't, people are often hesitant about using this phrase lone actor because they say nobody's ever lone, but Thomas Mayer actually was a lone actor. He had no proven face-to-face contact with extreme right groups or activists. He had ordered stuff from America, a group called the National Alliance, but otherwise no other contact. You have people like Darren Osborne, and you've had the 17-year-old who was convicted in Durham quite recently. Then you have networked groups, and they're networked usually through the internet. So you have people like Zach Davis, who attempted to murder a cyclist in Mould in Flintshire, Ethan Stables in Cumbria, who planned an attack on a private event in a pub in Cumbria. Jack Coulson, Bradford and Leeds, I think, was arrested for, he's been convicted twice, arrested for building a pipe bomb in his room. These were people who were networked with groups like National Action, mainly through the internet. So online space is important here. It's a proliferation of channels that people can link into to find groups such as National Action's Sonic Creed Division. Coming back to the issue around mental health vulnerabilities, there's a targeting of mental health vulnerabilities. There's also a desire to recruit military personnel. We've seen a large increase in the number of convictions for terrorist-related convictions. A lot of these relate to membership of National Action, which was prescribed in 2016. The first extreme right group to have that done to them. We've had 8 plots disrupted since 2017. We've had an increase in prevent referrals, which I think has pretty much balanced out in the northeast between Islamist and far right referrals. And the northeast as a region has the highest number of referrals associated with far right views. 16.7% went to Channel. I put this slide here from Sonic Creed Division. Just the thing to note is the use of graphics. You know, it's quite a different look from, you know, it's digitally literate, and that's part of its appeal. at the other end of the spectrum, the more civic nationalist. So I've got, so you have groups. Well, what's happened over really since lockdown, I would say, is that across this spectrum, is that groups have gathered around two poles. If you take revolutionary groups out of it, they will do their thing online, it's clandestine. You won't usually hear about it. They're doing stuff on encrypted channels. If you take them out of the equation, basically the movement or the spectrum is split around two opposing poles. On one side, you have the civic nationalists. Really sort of their most leading figure is Tommy Robinson. Around Tommy Robinson, groups like Britain First and For Britain have cohered. This is quite strange because Britain First and Tommy Robinson for a long time didn't get on. Britain First was seen as a little bit virgin. You know, Britain First was formed out of the BNP and seen to be too veering towards old-fashioned sort of racism for the likes of people like Robinson, who concentrates much more on this thing that I'm not racist, I'm just, you know, it's more about Islam and Muslims. They both, but recently they've sort of cohered together. They've made an alliance, basically. They recently promised to attend each other's court appearances. So there's a sort of bromance going on between Tommy Robinson and Paul Golding of Britain First. So it's almost like an alliance. They're ploughing a similar furrow at the moment. They both exploit anti-Muslim sentiment. Up until recently, they were off. Really, their main form of mobilisation was around anti-grooming campaigns. Again, think about the emotive worth of this. So Tommy Robinson's been a bit on the, I would say, his star is moon is waning at the moment. But they have got a demo. His Hearts of Oak organisation have a demo planned in Rochdale on the 31st of October. This has been postponed, so that's why the date is there. And this campaign really is around deport the groomers. So this refers to 3 perpetrators of CSE who were meant to be deported after they served their prison sentences but haven't been. And you know, what's to note about this is it's a very hard thing to, most people will agree. It resonates with a lot of people. They see that as common sense. You know, so it's a populist campaign. Recently, campaigns, Britain First were also campaigning very heavily around this. They were visiting places like Oldham and Rochdale. But recently they're taking a sort of bit of a step back, and where the sort of main impetus has been recently is increasingly focused on migration. And migration, and particularly the housing of asylum seekers in hotels and more recently in barracks. They often position themselves as journalists, you know, so we're not doing anything wrong, we're just reporting on the truth, especially Robinson. So he's sort of invented himself as this citizen journalist. So he sits somewhere in between now, between being an activist, a journalist, and a sort of celebrity vlogger. They often concentrate on sort of backlash politics. And what I mean by this is sort of movements like the statue defenders, and a backlash against Black Lives Matter. So that's one pole. The other pole is the more ethnic nationalist. This has more local interest for you because the main people that are, well, Robinson's sort of star has gone down a little bit. What has risen has been Patriotic Alternative, led by Mark Collett, formerly of the BNP, based in Yorkshire, I believe Leeds, and Deputy Laura Taylor, again based somewhere in Yorkshire. They're ethnic nationalist. Then it's not, for them, it's not just about we don't like Islam, we don't like Muslims, we think it's incompatible with the West. That's part of it. But really, they want Britain to be for the British, and the British for them are defined ethnically. You know, you cannot be, it's defined by skin colour. Basically, the big division between the ethnic nationalists and civic nationalists are over demographics. So that, you know, the English people are being replaced. So again, this hinges back to that narrative of the Great Replacement. The other dividing line is over what patriotic alternative and their like call the Jewish question. So this is not just like a difference between groups that is sort of my nerdy far right train spotting sort of academic sense. There are real differences and they don't like each other. You know, Robinson is constantly referred, and for Britain are constantly referred to as shills or Zai nationalists. And really this is carrying on the anti-Semitic thing. Patriotic, Laura Towler, they often use, they're sort of slightly hipper. They're attracting the more sort of feral crowd as well. So the 4chaners, the gamers, groups like Patriotic Groypers, Iconoclast, 100-handers. I know you've had a lot of 100-handers stickering in within Yorkshire. They use pranks. So Laura Towler tweeted that I'm dead chuffed that Yorkshire Tea hadn't supported Black Lives Matter, and Yorkshire Tea responded to that. But what it did is it generated lots of coverage for Patriotic Alternative. It made a lot more people aware of them. So it's like a prank to garner attention. Also on they held an Indigenous Peoples Day on August the 14th, where activists all over the country took photos of themselves with White Lives Matter banners, including one outside Yorkshire Minster. I keep saying, you know, these differences are not academic. Different groups adopt different strategies. So if you take the backlash against Black Lives Matter in London and the statue defenders things, the demonstration for the statue defenders was called by Tommy Robinson. Patriotic Alternative, who were outraged by pictures of defacing the War Memorial, Winston Churchill. These are things that will resonate with a lot of people. They called for people to mobilise in London. Patriotic Alternative said, no, don't. If you care about this, don't go to London. Let Black Lives Matter trash the statue of Winston Churchill, and it will open the eyes of the normies. By normies, they mean normal people who, you know, are not sort of do not believe in their narratives, basically. You know, if you let Black Lives Matter run riot in London, then it will help us build our argument. You know, Patriotic Alternative are putting materials about homeschooling. They're putting curriculum materials on their websites. Yeah, they're not just concerned with, we don't want a mosque built in our backyard sort of thing. So it's a very different proposition. Where things have really changed, as I've said before, is in the online space. And this has really enabled a lot of these changes. A lot of the big players, people like Robinson, have been deplatformed. At one point, he had over 1 million followers on Facebook. So deplatforming has worked to the extent that it cuts down on their reach. And most people have been deplatformed at this stage. But what's happened is people have just migrated to other platforms. Platforms, particularly Telegram, which is encrypted channels, and VK, which is the Russian version of Facebook. But also platforms like GAB, BitChute, DLive. And this is a concern because if you want to know what's going on at the moment across the spectrum, you need to be looped into these channels and you need to be monitoring it. A lot of my time now is sending people screenshots off social media. There's a whole range here. You know, what it has meant, although their reach, you know, Robinson is no longer racking up followers of 1 million. He's got about 30,000 followers on Telegram. So it's a big, that's a big fall in sort of people who are viewing his stuff. But it's become more covert, and there is an expansion of the demographic. So people, far-right and minority groups are attracting people from 4chan, 8chan, which are bulletin boards, from gamer culture, from men's rights groups that have a heavy presence online. They use memes, which are often really misogynist, very anti-Semitic. The appeal can be, it's very irreverent, it's very transgressive, it feels countercultural, and it's exciting and opaque to a lot of people. It appeals to teenagers in their bedrooms, young people who, you know, have a gripe, or they want to sort of kick against the establishment. I mean, these slides are quite interesting. If you look at, I mean, this is how they see it themselves. This is off a bulletin board on 4chan. Starting with gamers. So you start with video gamers, then you move on to sort of anti-social justice activists. So it's the kickback against political correctness. Then you move through memes like Pepe memes, alt-right Pepe memes. Then you move to the alt-right. Then you become white nationalist. And then you move to Holocaust denial, but you wish it did. And then you move to the final one, let fascism happen to you. I'll make sure it doesn't. A picture of Adolf Hitler. They've got a very defined sense of aesthetics. So this slide of the two gentlemen in the top, rather frightening gentleman on the top right is, they call it terror wave. Again, it's got this sort of like gamer, irreverent appeal to it. They use memes. The most famous one at the moment is probably Pepe the Frog. And you see here, this is a combination of memes. Pepe the Frog loading a red pill into a gun. So they talk about people being red pilled. Red pilled has been taken off the Matrix. It's when someone was given, which in turn is taken off Alice in Wonderland. People are given a choice of a blue pill or a red pill. The blue pill lets them carry on an illusion of life. The red pill lets them see what lies behind the illusion. For the alt-right, behind the illusion is racial nationalism. But this is how they can recruit with people. I think the graphic with the progression from gamers to fascism is interesting. You could have a whole session on the use of digital landscape at the moment. And obviously it's a big concern at the moment because of lockdown, because people are spending a lot more time online, and especially young people. Moving on, mobilisation opportunities. This is where it gets tricky. So what provides windows of opportunity for these groups? They often draw, the most powerful narratives are the ones that draw on the concerns, issues and grievances of ordinary residents. There's revolutionary groups or groups that seek political objectives have always done this. They will try and latch onto things and bandwagon. It can provide mobilisation opportunities for anti-minority actors. The trouble is that you sort of get these hybrid campaigns, which can be a community campaign, but then outside agitators or people like Robinson have rocked up trying to exploit them. From my point of view, it means that you have to start engaging with your residents. I brought a particularly horrible example, but it's a powerful one. So this refers to the murder of Emily Jones in Bolton earlier, who was stabbed to death in a park on Mother's Day. Now think about the symbolism of it. A lot of people from the far right tried to jump on this as a terrorist incident, which it wasn't. The slogan here says, by a Somali migrant. This was incorrect, but this was spread online, and a lot of people have tried to mobilise around it. Her family came out and spoke against them in the end. What you're increasingly seeing, and this is the way of protest going forward, is these sort of hybrid campaigns. And recently I've been offering some support to Cumbria, where they've had a campaign called Justice for Ellie, over a young woman who made allegations of sexual grooming. And I won't go in at length, but was remanded on 7 counts of perverting the course of justice. So when she announced the allegations first on Facebook, Tommy Robinson visited 6 times in 6 days, held rallies up there. It was all over online space. People were using it as proof that there was a Muslim invasion of Britain and that it's a rape jihad. So a very local incident can become a concern for all these different actors, can get picked up by all these different people. But at the heart of it, it was a genuine community-led campaign. So that makes it really, that was organised mainly by her family, who also told Tommy Robinson at one point to jog on. So this makes it very hard to respond to it. How do you respond to things that can be community-led? There's this mix of genuine community concerns, but also people trying to bandwagon political agendas on the back of it. Increasingly, you're seeing stuff around anti-lockdown, anti-vax, and 5G. You're seeing this a lot with QAnon. And this is a real hybrid, just mix of different concerns. And the first time I ever heard of anything about 5G was on the website of Justice for Women and Children that definitely had an anti-minority flavour. It's hard to disentangle these narratives from genuine community concerns and people with political agenda. When it comes to QAnon and anti-lockdown stuff, I'd say they're not necessarily extreme or far right, but they swim in the same water without a doubt. And the one thing that they do share is a real anti-system thrust. They thrive on the distrust and lack of trust in state actors. I've used a couple of photos here just to sort of show the variety of concerns. This is the two banners are taken from a Freedom for the Children demonstration in Newcastle, which is a group that again is campaigning around sexual grooming. It's not necessarily extreme, but you would say some of their ideas are quite extreme. If we take this bottom banner, why are we still talking about a virus no more deadly than the flu, where there are paedophiles running our government and trafficking, Hollywood included, our children right under our noses? Coronavirus is a huge distraction. And then at the top one, there's a sign saying execute the elite. Now, I looked through the Facebook pages of the moderators on this group, and it's mainly women. So it's aiming at quite a specific demographic who are leading activists within it. There are men involved for sure, but a lot of the leading activists are women. I looked through their Facebook pages, and it's all yoga studios, Pilates, and life coaching. So it's quite a different demographic. But I would stress, I think these movements, you're going to see a lot more of these protests. And what they really thrive on is this anti-system distrust. And that is dangerous, I think. One last example, and then I'll shut up. Just to bring this all together, and this is a campaign that I will talk at length about on Friday. So this is Justice for Chelsea campaign. It was started in Sunderland in September 2016. And really this started after a young woman made allegations of sexual crime perpetrated by 6 asylum seekers in Sunderland. This sparked a locally led campaign initially that led to 13 demonstrations in this period, September 2016 to 2017. This had a massive impact on Sunderland. This was also while Sunderland was preparing a City of Culture bid, which you could imagine how that went down. The campaign started locally. What happened was that almost every person that I talked about in these previous slides, from Britain First, Stephen Yaxley Lennon, For Britain, all turned up at various different points, trying to exploit this campaign to push their narratives. They were also supported by a group called Rebel Media, who are based in Canada, which is a sort of neo-conservative website. They paid for Chelsea's lawyer to appeal. The campaign really kicked off after she made some allegations on Facebook. The police arrested some people and made a decision, made an evidence-based decision to take no further action. And it was the decision to take no further action which really kicked off the campaign. She made an appeal. Her legal team was supported by Rebel Media. Sunderland Council were suddenly getting FOIs from Ontario, Canada. This was being watched across the world, so a very local incident. went international. I'll talk about this a lot more on Friday, so I don't want to talk too much about it. The main thing to think is something very local can have quite a large impact. The campaign died down for various reasons in October 2017. In 2018, May, there were a series of sexual assaults in the same area of the city of Sunderland. The perpetrators of 2 of those sexual assaults were asylum seekers. Again, this started another campaign called the Justice for Women and Children. Again, it involved a mix of local residents who were just, had genuine and justified concerns, but also exploited by people coming in from outside, and some local extreme right activists. Several demos also staged in Middlesbrough. They had a big demonstration with the Democratic Football Lads, Lions. I think of 2,000 plus people. It was supported by a lot of different actors. It had a big impact on Sunderland as well. This impacts on the cohesion of a town. Had a narrative framing of the safety of women and children, which I've said, this has got a very powerful emotional pull. I'll talk a lot more about these campaigns on Friday, and really what I talk about is these things happened in Sunderland and they had a big impact. They have a big reputational impact on the city as well. But really they could, given the right windows of opportunity, they could happen anywhere. And really what I talk about today, I talked about the different groups, the different actors, the differences between them, why they're important. On Friday, I'll talk about what is it that creates that perfect window of opportunity. And I think I will leave it there. I would welcome any questions if you have any.
So there were a couple of questions in the chat, Gareth. I don't know if you could see them or if you want me to read them out.
Yeah, okay. Based on what you said, what strategies do you suggest? Know of that ensure that people are involved with the aim of preventing establishment groups, at the same time being aware of any narratives that exist. I mean, as I said, I'm not someone who will come into your area and tell you what to do, because I think you know what's going on in your area, and you know the local conditions. What I know about is I work everywhere. I work from Luton, from Dover to Oldham to Sunderland, so I do span most of the country now. And there's a couple of points about that as well. So in terms of, there are things that I noticed that have helped in other areas. And, in terms of, if I had to make a recommendation from working in this field, I'd say the main challenge I think you're facing now is this issue of hybrid campaigns, where people come in and exploit genuine community concerns. And the way to head this off, or where you have these hybrid campaigns, the first thing I'd emphasise is engage when you can. If you can engage, an example of what I mean by this, when the second campaign started in Sunderland, the council very wisely decided to hold a community meeting in the local Tesco's. So they didn't hold it in the town hall, they held it in the community room in the local Tesco's, which houses 30 people. 250 residents turned up, so they had to move it to the Sally Army. They started the meeting, it was really hostile. The first person who spoke up had started saying, what about all these Muslim grooming gangs, blah, 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 just ranted on about it. And a woman at the back stood up and said, actually, I hate to contradict you, but this has got nothing to do with race or religion. This is about the safety of women. And for me, seeing that, I thought, the council, you need to talk to that person. Because if you talk to that person, you can start sifting out the people who are trying to sort of capitalise on prejudice and promote their own hatred with people who actually genuinely have a concern. So that's one thing, is engagement. And I can't emphasise how important I think that is over these issues. I'm not sure that totally answered the question, but it's a big question. So you brought in the other thing about being aware that these narratives exist. And this is the other thing, is horizon scanning, looking for where there are opportunities. And the way that you do this, I think, is one way of doing this is through multi-agency partnerships. Make sure that you have strong, partnerships with the people who matter. So that if the police make a decision around, say there is a CSE court case coming up in an area where there's already been mobilisation by the far right around CSE, that the police speak to someone, and say, do you know you've got this coming up on the horizon? So there's information sharing across agencies is very important. And the final thing I would say, understand is what is going on in your community. One way you do that is with engagement, but also listening to your frontline staff. And I know this is difficult in the current times of austerity, but your youth workers, your people who work in leisure centres or have contact with the most contact with people, your bin men, make sure your frontline staff, one, are on board, and two, that you're speaking to them, because those are your PCSOs, your community police. Make sure that you've always got a sense of what's blowing in the wind in your communities. I hope that answered that. It's a bit of a big question, so that's the rest of it is maybe something for later.
Sue here has got her hand up. If Sue wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, hi, Gareth. You mentioned about autism, people with autism, being groomed for these, to be involved in these sort of things. I just wondered if you knew of any work that's been done nationally to raise awareness with people who have autism, because obviously we know the range is massive, or with organisations like, like the autism support groups and things like that.
I don't know of any specific work, and it's a really good question because I should know, but I am sure there is specific work going on. Certainly, Zach Davis, there's definitely an issue around the conviction of Zach Davis and mental health vulnerabilities, without question. And I think this has also been flagged up for the case of Ethan Stables as well. So I would be flabbergasted if there is not work currently being devoted to this, dedicated to this, but offhand I don't know without some research. But I will follow up on that and try and find out. So if I do find anything out, I will put it your way through Gillian. But I would have thought, some of the big charities that are working around autism might be a good place to start.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry, I couldn't give you a more qualified answer on that.
I know. Well, I work with people who have a learning disability and also, could have autistic traits or be autistic as well. But I haven't really seen anything, although I've, part of the Prevent group locally. Anything nationally going on. I just was interested to know. Thank you.
I will have a dig around, and if I do find anything, I'll make sure I get it over to you.
Thank you.
Any other sort of verbal questions? Otherwise, I'll go back to the chat.
There's no one else with their hand up at the minute. Thank you.
Okay. Question. Why do you think prevent referrals are high in the North East? Are we better at noticing concerns? I said that I work the breadth of the country, but I have to say I'm working increasingly in the North. I think there are obvious issues around structural deprivation, socio-economic disadvantage, absolutely without a doubt. What I have noticed recently as well is whenever there's a list of the top 20 COVID hotspots, I'm working in every one of them almost. And I don't think that's coincidence. there's often something around post-industrial landscapes as well. Even when I've worked in the south, so I've worked in one of the areas in the south that I've worked in a lot has been Luton, and Luton is often described as a northern town in the south, and it has very much got the characteristics of the northern ex-mill towns as well. I do think you notice it in the northeast. I think there's been a considerable upskilling, particularly in the north, because for a while, well, actually one of the basic things, and I hate talking about areas that are vulnerable or people being vulnerable. I find it really quite irritating, and I think it has the danger of stigmatizing areas, which makes it worse. Why do you think prevent referrals are higher in the northeast? I'll tell you why. First and foremost, because these are areas that anti-minority actors target. They devote resources. So when I talked about Sunderland, every anti-minority actor who's got a face in the UK targeted Sunderland because they thought they would get a result. They thought they would be able to mobilise support. So the first thing is you've got to prevent referrals associated with the far right because the far right have been targeting it. They think they will find a fertile environment there. That, at the heart of it, that's the first thing. Then overlap, why do they think that they will find a fertile environment there is another question. And that's when you can start talking about structural disadvantage, segregated communities, whatever you want to talk about. That can vary across from context. So, I'll talk about this on Friday, but you could say, okay, areas where there's a high degree of segregation, some areas of Greater Manchester, Oldham, Rochdale, Bolton. I'm not meaning to stigmatise those areas, but they have high binary populations, South Asian, white British. But far right also target areas like Sunderland, where Sunderland is probably about 96% white British. So, it doesn't necessarily follow. Any other verbal questions?
The last question on the chat is from me, but I'm conscious that it's 12 o'clock, so it might be something that I can drop you an email on, or maybe we can cover on Friday's input instead, if that's okay.
As I said, once the slides have gone down, I think I would like to have sort of like informal Q&A session once people have had a chance to sort of digest it and look over things. And people are always welcome to contact me, and they can get my email from Janine or Leslie.
Yep, I think that's a great idea. If there is any questions that people think of between now and Friday, I know a lot of people that are on the call today are joining us on Friday as well. If they want to drop me an email or Peter Cunningham, NYCC, an email with those, then we can make sure that they're asked and answered. And if you're not on the call on Friday, get those responses back to you. But I think an informal Q&A session at least down the line is a great idea.
Okay then, thanks a lot for attending. I know this is not the ideal format. I'm someone who likes to jump about, so I find it very hard to do this sort of thing sitting at my desk. But thank you for attending. I hope you got something good out of it.
Thank you for your time, Gav. Much appreciated. See you Friday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.